You are listening to Realign Your Life podcast, where I discuss with you strategies on how to realign your life and move towards the direction you always want to. I am Vivian, the host of this podcast, and every week I will bring value on how to improve and realign your life either through a guest or my thoughts. I can't wait to share what we have this week. It's time to realign your life. Well, hello, and welcome back to Realign Your Life podcast. I am so excited for you to be here, and most of all, I'm honored for you to listen. This is Vivian, the host of this show. And as I always promise you, we're going to have something very, very good for you today in this episode as we go on this journey together of realigning our lives. So, so often as we are realigning our lives, there are things that come into our lives that we have to make that adjustment for. And sometimes it is a crisis. And you know what I call that sometimes is trauma. Because for you or for me, it could be very traumatic. And so today I have a wonderful, wonderful guest with us, Stacey Sutherland. Welcome, Stacey, to Realign Your Life.
Hey, Vivian. It's so good to be with you. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited for the information and all of the wonderful tidbits that you're going to be able to share with our listening audience today and how and what trauma is all about. So let me share with you a little bit about Stacey and what her expertise is. Well, she is the director of the nonprofit Crisis Care International, CCI, and they provide trauma-sensitive care and training to global communities that are impacted by conflict, crisis, and disaster. So they specialize in debriefing, support, and equipping those that are coming alongside these people to be able to handle and to walk them through crisis situations. So she is a specialist in crisis and trauma recovery, and she has a graduate degree in pastoral counseling, and she is a nationally board certified coach. So we've got all of this wonderful expertise right here at our fingertips on Realign Your Life. So Stacey, I am so excited for you to be here with us. And at the end of this episode, right at the end, Stacey's going to share some information with you, how you can consult with her and that you can reach her. So I just want us to go ahead and get started, Stacey, because I started out with, how we define trauma. So most of us define trauma as something that, it's a hurricane or it's a tornado or something, a tsunami, something that is just devastating to a community at hand. But as we realign our lives individually, we can also go through trauma. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. So trauma, a lot of people do think about trauma as an event that happens, but trauma is really about the perception, a person's perception of an event. And that's why two people can go through the very same thing, Vivian. They might be in a car accident and two people go through the car accident. One person walks away, maybe they're not physically injured, but one person goes away and is just, they're relieved. That was super stressful. And they go about their day. The other person walks away and they can't get back in a car or they can't drive a car again for a long time. And that's the difference. Two people having different perceptions or experiences around the same event. And that makes all the difference for us.
Wow. And that is so true because, and it's interesting that you use that example because my granddaughter is working with her piano teacher who was in a car accident. And she has not driven for over 5 years. And that because that was so traumatic for her. And she says, I just can't get behind a wheel again right now, but eventually I will. So when we talk about that, what are some of the signs and symptoms for unresolved trauma? Because it sounds like this is kind of unresolved for her.
Yeah. Well, first, before we get to unresolved trauma, let's talk about some of the more normal trauma symptoms, right?
Yeah.
That anybody can experience. And so we want to make sure not to pathologize trauma. So our body has a natural stress response to things that overwhelm us. And so some of the ways that we might, that somebody might experience that, if you think about it in 3 categories of ways, one way might be reliving. So we talked about the car accident. So think about a person who they are having flashbacks about that moment that they were in the accident. Or maybe they start having nightmares about somebody being injured or hurt or some part of it. So that's one kind of category. Another category would be avoiding. And they might avoid driving down the same road where that car accident happened, or they might avoid driving a car. They are so stressed that the thought of getting in the car again is so triggering, and so they avoid doing it. No one wants to relive. No one wants to feel the emotions or the thoughts that the trauma brought in the first place. And so anything that can pull us back to that, we just naturally avoid doing it. Now, sometimes people will default to drugs, alcohol. There's lots of ways. I mean, we binge on Netflix or something. There's lots of ways we keep ourselves occupied, or we do things to numb overwhelming emotion. And so those are all avoiding type tactics. A third way that we respond that's normal is being hyper alert or hyper vigilant. And so we might feel that danger is around us all the time. Even when we're actually in a safe place, we still feel that stress. Maybe our heart races. Maybe we're having a panic attack because our sympathetic nervous system is so heightened and sensitive. So those are the 3 main ways or categories kind of, and there's lots of behaviors and things that fit under those. But what we say is when somebody goes through a traumatic event or experience or even chronic things that happen over time, those are normal stress reactions, traumatic stress reactions. But if they continue and the person is not able to regain coping and equilibrium, and they begin to impact their daily living and relationships, then that becomes a problem. And that's when we start looking at diagnosable traumatic injuries like PTSD. So when something impacts you and you're still having these problems and they're not going away in a month or a couple months, that's when we start thinking, okay, I think I need to get some professional care to see if this trauma wound is actually an injury. Yeah.
So that's when you need to begin that process of healing.
Yeah.
That's part of the healing process. So so you talked about some of the indications there that is necessary. So if you are living with that person, how do you get that person to recognize or to realize that they need that help? Or if it's an individual, how do we know to move toward that place?
Right.
Do we need help?
Well, first of all, a little information goes a long way. So just the knowledge of what trauma is because I think in our minds, we often think of trauma like the big disaster. I mean, I do disaster response work, and truly, an earthquake or something that is traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't often think about the things in our life that cause the key elements of trauma that we go through all the time. The key elements of trauma are overwhelming fear and helplessness, powerlessness to stop it. There's a lot of things that fall in that category. You can even think about a divorce for someone where maybe they didn't want it. The partner left them and it was sudden. It felt like a betrayal. And so there's overwhelming fear and powerlessness in that situation. And again, it's about perception, right? Because another person, they might experience a divorce and they feel relief. Or maybe they were the one that chose it, right? They decided to take the steps to do it. So for them, they're not powerless. So that overwhelming fear and powerlessness are really important. A lot of times I'll take people to the story of Elijah in Scripture in 1 Kings chapter 19, where, it's after that time where he had the great victory over the prophets of Baal, and they did all this. They were trying to prove their gods. And in the end, Elijah's God was victorious, and they were defeated. And the very next day, Queen Jezebel says, "I'm coming after you." And so what we see in that chapter is a really clear trauma response from Elijah. It wasn't because he didn't have faith. It wasn't because he wasn't a strong person. He was overwhelmed with fear, and he knew he was powerless to stop this queen. So what did he do? He ran. It says he ran. So there's that, we hear the fight, flight, freeze. It's real in trauma. And so when a person has a traumatic response like that, it's instinctively happening. They're not consciously thinking through, what can I do? Because actually, the part of the brain here that controls that kind of critical thinking is offline. We're not operating out of that anymore. If something is overwhelming enough, our brain is now in survival mode. And that's what happened to Elijah. And so he ran for his life. Completely normal response. He ran and ran and ran, and then he was exhausted, and he sat down under a tree, and God knew exactly what he needed. And God said, "Take a rest," and then sent help for him. And so the help came, the food, some water to drink, really practical things, because that's what he needed, sleep and some good food. And over time, he was able to get up, and actually God sent him on a long walk, which is also another really healthy thing that happened. But what we see about Elijah is he didn't have any physical wound, but he had an invisible wound. There's something going on there. And he even tells God, I have had enough. Yeah. And he wants to die. So he's become suicidal in his thinking. He's so afraid, and he's so overwhelmed with what's happened to him. And this is a really strong trauma response. I mean, the Bible doesn't say trauma, but there are examples of trauma throughout Scripture. And so I always encourage people, Vivian, try to look at Scripture through the lens of trauma, because you're going to see it all over. And then what happens is we don't feel so bad and like such failures, because a lot of times that shame, trauma brings a lot of shame. People feel ashamed of the way that their body is reacting and their mind is reacting, or their behavior. And so if we can sort of alleviate that shame for people, I think that's a really good first step in helping them understand what normal trauma symptoms are. And I often say to people, look, I know it feels overwhelming and crazy to you, what's going on in your body and these triggers you keep having, but it's perfectly normal considering the terrible thing that you've been through or are still going through, maybe. And then I just walk them through what's normal so that they feel more relieved, like, oh, I'm not crazy. Because there are actual physiological processes going on in the body that happen we're not thinking of it. Elijah wasn't thinking, run. He did it because his brain said, you need to survive, and that's how to do it. But when he did afterwards, he was exhausted. And trauma responses, there's a whole cascade of chemicals that goes through your body, adrenaline, cortisol, those nasty things, and they wreak havoc on our health. They make us feel terrible, and they just leave us feeling fatigued and overwhelmed. And Elijah had all of that going on. And God knew just how to take care of him. He did. It was a beautiful story.
It is a beautiful story. And I love that. And I'm so glad that you shared that with our audience, because it does let us know that as we are realigning our lives and the things, you mentioned divorce or some of as we're realigning our lives, it could be a job loss.
Yeah.
Or it could be the loss of a loved one or somebody, and just totally having to totally realign our lives. And these are the responses. And I just think I love the fact that you shared this Bible study story of Elijah and how that, you talked earlier about that sympathetic nervous system kicking in, that fight or flight. Mm-hmm. And it is so beautiful how God has engineered our bodies to be able to react to trauma and to other injuries that happen to our body. But he also has the answer for us also. Like you shared that, hey, rest. And sometimes that's what our bodies need.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's just so difficult for us to get to that place where this society says that you always got to be doing, you always got to be going. Yeah. But sometimes we just need to stop and reflect.
Really
and you talk about that, and this is such a beautiful story. And you listeners, I pray that you would just hold on to that story and you go read it for yourself in Kings. And so what would you say the role, you talked about so many times, you mentioned a couple of times how you share with people that this is normal. So how does therapy and counseling, what part do they play in addressing trauma?
Yeah, a lot of my clients have a trauma history. And I think most therapists, what we want to help people do is, first of all, we want them to help be regulated, because trauma does feel so overwhelming. And what happens is when there's a trigger and the brain feels like there's danger, it remembers. So trauma leaves this legacy in the body and in the mind. And so when a trigger happens, and it may be months, even years after the original event happened to us, but we can feel like our body might feel like it's right back in that dangerous time. And so all the overwhelming emotions, sometimes, our heart racing, we might freeze up, we might not be able to think clearly, just all kinds of things can happen because of this physiological response that goes on when our brain gets that little trigger. And so in counseling, what we want to do is first help people calm down that response in their body. And we want them to listen to their body and pay attention. So instead of fighting it, oh no, why am I thinking like this? Why am I worried? I'm perfectly safe. And they're trying to convince themselves, but their body feels differently because it remembers a time when they weren't safe. So helping people have that compassion and curiosity for what's going on. What am I experiencing? What triggered this? Maybe they can identify it, maybe they can't. And then what can I do that could help me move out of this state where I can feel more safe? Do I need to go for a walk? Maybe just in the short term, I need to go get a hot cup of tea. I need to do some breathing. We do some grounding exercises and breathing because oxygen helps regulate all that. So really simple things at first, just to help people regulate the response so they can do the trauma work. For me, I think a big part in my own life and helping other people with trauma, it really is that being curious, stop trying to fight it, befriend it. Stop fighting, befriend it, and then be compassionate with yourself about what's going on. You have a real wound. And if you had a big cast on your leg, you would take it easy because you'd know that you were injured. And it's that way with trauma. Sometimes we just need to remind ourselves, I've been wounded. The other thing that I think as counseling helps with, and even as we just come alongside each other as peers and peer support, because that's where most people get help, Vivian. Most people don't go to a therapist. I mean, I wish more people did, but most don't. Yeah. They go to their pastor, they go to their friend or their sister or somebody like that. So you help each other by come alongside. Let's go for a walk together. We do the things that help us to grieve, because trauma always involves loss. And loss means we've got to grieve our losses. So part of healing from trauma is learning how to slowly and compassionately allow ourselves to grieve the pain and grieve what we've lost. Yet, I lead communities in lament and teach individuals about the power of lament, which is very scriptural.
Yes.
Just being honest with God about the pain and having a safe place to be listened to. And we can provide that for each other. You don't necessarily have to go to a counselor, but to be a good listener is something that takes skill and practice. And it means we shut up and we listen without judging somebody. And we just really give them a safe place to tell their story when they feel like telling it. And that makes a world of difference for someone. Not everybody needs to tell their story, but a lot of us do. Yeah. And we don't need to go deep and messy and gory into all the details, but just to be able to be a compassionate witness for someone else is so healing for them.
You've given us some really good practical strategies in order to, deal with trauma as we are maybe realigning our lives. So how does, you talked about that, but how can someone just practically begin that process of realigning their life after experiencing trauma?
Yeah, I would say, first off, who are the good listeners in your life? If you don't have community, find yourself some good community, some good, safe community. The people who are going to listen and love you and have compassion and help remind you to have compassion on yourself too. And it might mean you might need a community that is, they're wise to trauma. And I like to use the term trauma sensitive instead of just trauma informed, because I think anybody can read a book and be informed about, or listen to a podcast and you can be informed about trauma. But to really be trauma sensitive takes skill, and it takes, it just takes some, just like it says, trauma sensitivity. You've got to be able to be in tune to the people around you, and just know that, it's not always written on their face what they've gone through. You don't know. So really finding a safe place, I think, Vivian, is really, really important.
Yeah, because we are so good. We have learned to be so good at hiding our emotions and things that are truly going on to our lives. And, people often say, well, how are you doing? How's life going for you? And the first thing we say is, it's well. And, you are just torn apart inside. And so often we've talked on this podcast about self-care, and the importance of having compassion for yourself, the importance of having a safe community around you. But, as you talk about being trauma sensitive and being able to share with people, it sounds like that too is kind of a process that we need to learn, or we need to be also educated on. Just more than just listening or being informed about something, but actually knowing truly how to deal with that. And I know that in your practice, you do that and you help people with that. So for myself or for other listeners that are out there that want to be that person that can help my fellow colleague or my fellow friend or my fellow family member, or, just someone, that I may just be becoming acquainted with. How do I myself become trauma sensitive or know how to be trauma sensitive?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I lead small groups or workshops in these kind of things where we talk about what it means to be a good listener, and we actually do practicums and we practice those really important skills. We, having conversations about what safety is, because it's easy to throw that word around, but we don't really examine the ways that we're safe people, or maybe we're not. And even being brave enough to ask people that are close to you, do you think I'm a safe person? Tell me honestly. Or how can I improve? I want to be a more safe person for you to tell your story. What are things I could do differently? Really learning what your impact on others is as a helper. Are you a person they can come to when they're hurting? And if they're not, or you notice something's holding people back, or maybe they come to you first and then they don't come back. What keeps you from listening? That's always a question I ask people when I'm mentoring and coaching them. Is there something, when you are with someone and they're trying to tell their story, is there part of you that keeps wanting to talk and say something, to give them advice? Because maybe you've got some good advice on this topic. That's about you. And you want to press into those things about you that keep you from being a good listener to other people. It could be there's something triggering you. It could be that sometimes we don't sit well with grief. And in the Christian community, we don't sit with grief. We want the happy ending and we want it right now. Why can't we do that? And those are some of the questions I think communities have to start unpacking. What can help us be better? And so that's one of the things I do with communities that I go to, or like I'll do workshops for groups that want to explore that kind of thing. Sometimes I'll go work with churches after a season of there's been conflict or there's been some division or whatever in the church. And we just need to spend some time healing and figuring out what a path to healing looks like, and maybe what the barriers are to healing for them. So those are some questions to explore in your communities.
Well, and Tracy, Stacey, you say that, but I think it would be great if we even got this kind of training before trauma.
Yeah.
So then we know how to deal with it, or we know how to become great listeners. I think this would be a great session for small groups. So churches are now going into small groups. And as you are in that small group or a part of that small group, there is invariably something that is going to happen to somebody in that group. It's like, what is that? You're either coming out of a storm, you're in the middle of a storm, or you go into a storm.
It's true. Or you're walking alongside somebody at the moment that's going through a storm. So somebody's in one all the time. There is a great program, Vivian, through the Trauma Healing Institute. And the Trauma Healing Institute is like a sister arm of the American Bible Society. But they have a terrific program called Healing the Wounds of Trauma, How the Church Can Help. It's based around a book of that name. And we've used this. I've worked with them for years as a master facilitator in their program. But the material is terrific, and it's like a 6-week group dynamic where someone facilitates the group and people talk about things like what is trauma. They talk about grief. They talk about the hard issues, and they don't just talk about them. It's a lot of interaction and practical stuff. There's art exercise. There's like a real listening exercise. So that's a great place for communities or churches to start. I think I love that program, and I have recommended it all over the world to communities. So
that sounds absolutely wonderful. So Tracy, how can individuals, or how can our audience get in touch with you, or how do they find you? And in your bio, you do private counseling, a third. Mm-hmm. So, right. Okay.
Yeah. It's a coaching practice. I'm working on a clinical license, but I am a pastoral counselor and a coach and a crisis interventionist. So I have a private practice called Calm Harbor Consulting, and we can put the link for people. But if they like to book a session with me, they can book a 15-minute, like a consult, to see if we're a good fit, and we can talk about what they need. And then I want to offer your listeners a discount. So we can offer them a discount link too for a full session if they'd like to meet with me. The nonprofit I run, we do a lot of work globally, but we've also been working with some nonprofits right here in Charlotte and in the U.S. who focus on trafficking victims, refugee work, that kind of thing. And we typically go in and train their staff in these kind of trauma-sensitive care principles and practices. So I can work with people on both sides. But I would love to get in touch with them and start that journey of healing for them.
Yes. Well, I am just so thankful to God that we have people like you that are out here to educate us. And, being a believer, I believe that God has gifted all of us in certain areas, and that your area is in healing and in helping us to be whole, and that there is normalcy. There is normalcy in trauma also. It's okay. It's fine. You're not
broken beyond. I love in the story, Vivian, just what you're saying. I love in the Elijah story of somebody, they can just go read that whole chapter. I love how God says rest, and then he reminds him, you're not alone. Mm-hmm. I'm with you. I'm going to give you a helper because I know you're hurting, and I'm not finished with you yet. I've still got work for you to do.
And he said great things, didn't he?
Yeah.
Still ended up doing great things. So we're not going to tell you the end of Elijah's story. You're going to have to go research it yourself.
That's right. You've got to read it. 1 Kings chapter 19.
So Stacey, what are 3 things that you would leave with this audience today?
3 things I would say. Learn about trauma, understand trauma so that you can have, second thing, more compassion and curiosity for yourself and for the people that you come in contact with who've experienced trauma. And then I would say, find the thing that helps you feel 10% better. I mean, everybody wants to shoot for solving the problem or curing their trauma response, but how about just have that compassion on yourself and be a student of yourself and figure out what's going on and what do I need to do right now. What can help me feel just 10% better? What can move me just 10% more along that road to healing? That's what I'd like to leave with them.
Thank you so much, Stacey, for being with us today here.
Thank you, Vivian.
This has just been tremendous. And audience, I pray that you are taking away something not only for yourself, but that you can share with others. And if you have enjoyed this episode today and you find that it has helped you, please, if you know someone out there that this would also benefit and help, make sure you share this episode with them. And I thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Vivian.
I know that you're on your way out of here back to Morocco, where you have been helping so diligently and teaching and training those that have suffered from the earthquake. So I am praying for safe travel for you, and we will be praying for those victims there in Morocco, because I know you shared earlier with me that this is the rainy and the cold season that is about to come for those in the mountains. So is there any way that our listening audience, if they would like to support this?
Yeah, if you go to our website, crisiscareinternational.org, you can donate on that site, and that helps us to bring psychological care, mental health care to people in areas that really, really need it around the world. So thank you.
Thank you. And listeners, all of Stacey's information will be here on the podcast. So make sure that you listen in and make sure that you share. So thank you again for listening and tuning in to Realign Your Life. So until the next time, peace. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The best gift that you could give me is to share this podcast with family and friends. And don't forget to review it. That way, this podcast will grow organically. If you need to reach out to me, please check out my Facebook page, DM me there, or you can email me at godskow@gmail.com. We have upcoming Bible studies that we would love for you to join us in, or if there is a guest or someone that you would like to see me interview on this podcast, please let me know. We are here to work together to realign our lives. Until the next episode, take care, and I look forward to sharing more and more with you as we realign our lives. Peace until next week.